Hey everybody, welcome back. Our next presentation will be given by Jim Weiner and Charlie Foltz. These guys are famous. Yes, the Allagash Abductions. A most famous case, a most important case. A best-selling book by Ray Fowler. And thanks to Anne Couvalier, I've got to know Jim and Charlie quite well over the last few years. I now call them friends. Now that said, I want you all to know that they are regular guys, that they are just like you and me. Well, maybe you anyway. Well, all right. Look, I have to tell you that to this day, Charlie remains an avid fisherman. And do you know that every year he asks me to go fishing with him? Charlie, maybe next year. Please welcome Jim Weiner and Charlie Foltz.
Hi, Bob.
Hello, and thank you, and the UFO Congress, Bob, and all the people behind the scenes. And thank you for coming. Many of you may be familiar with our experience in the outback wilderness of northern Maine. But for those of you who are not, we're about to take you.
By the way, this is Charlie Foltz. I'm Jim Weiner.
We knew that.
We knew that, but you might not know who we are.
I'm sorry.
We have a lot to cover in this time slot, so if you don't mind, we'd like to get started right away. Charlie, are you ready to go to Maine?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, let's go.
Well, in 1976, Jim, his identical twin brother, Jack, and another friend from college, Chuck Rack, and I drove from Massachusetts up into northern Maine. We drove to spend 17 days in the wilderness, the first 3 of which we spent in Baxter State Park, climbing Mount Katahdin, which is the beginning or end of the Appalachian Trail, and then continued on to the Allagash waterway. This is just a couple of quick photos of what we looked like back then. And some of the crazy things we did. I had hair, that's the only photograph I have to prove it. We spent our first 3 days getting prepared for the next 14 on the Allagash. The Allagash stretches from, I don't know if you can see on the screen, the cursor as it's moving up, it's a series of lakes and connected to the Allagash River, one of only 2 rivers in Maine that flow north. The only way to get in there is by airplane or logging road. And the airplane that we flew in is similar to those that you might see taking off the river here in the morning. We loaded up the plane and strapped a canoe on it and flew in 2 at a time. And this is a photograph of Mount Katahdin that we had to fly by. And Mount Katahdin, we will mention again, in the significance of it being approximately 1 mile in height, comes into play later on. This is the plane that dropped us off, and then we had to register with the rangers.
One of the odd things that occurred on the first day is when the ranger came to our campsite, as they do all campers' sites, they come to register you in. As Charlie said, they also check to make sure that you have adequate provisions to survive up in the wilderness. It is an extreme wilderness area, and they want to make sure you're going to survive. One of the other things they check for is your itinerary of campsites. Every camper is given a map of the Allagash, the lake, and the river system, and you're asked to mark the campsites that you plan on spending time at. So if anything goes wrong and you wind up disappearing, the rangers have an idea of where to begin to look for you. Well, we had showed the ranger our map with our campsites marked on them, and there was one specific campsite at a little lake called Hammock Lake. And we had wanted to go trout fishing there, and it was connected to one of the larger lakes, Eagle Lake, by a brook called Smith Brook. When the ranger saw that we had planned on going to that campsite, he said, "You can't go there." And we said, "Well, why not?" And he said, "Well, the water level is really low for this time of year, and Smith Brook is unnavigable. So you can't get your canoe from Eagle Lake to Hammock Lake or Hammock Pond. So we've closed that section of the waterway down, so you're going to have to find another place to go." And we were like, "Well, okay, sure." And as soon as he left, we thought, well, we're going to go there anyway. we want to catch fish. But this does come up later on as an odd little fact about this trip.
Well, the first day that we got out on the water, we were getting used to being able to paddle as a team. Was Jack and Jim's first time in a canoe, and it was my about third time. I had canoed on rivers, but not on open lakes, and we battled a wind all day long going north, which slowed our progress. This is this photograph is of Jim and Chuck, and we were really proficient by the time we were on the river system. But our first day, we only made it up the lake. I don't know if you can see this. I'm having a little bit of problem with the cursor. Oops. We went up to this point on the lake, which is Mud Pond, which you can see in the bottom center of the screen. It was about dusk, and we decided that this was as far as we were going to progress, and we decided to make camp. We started pulling our gear out and soon decided, because the wind was blowing right down on top of us, to abandon the windy side and cross the water by the trees to a sheltered area at the other campsite. There were some other campers at this campsite, and when we landed there, they asked if we had seen two members of their party, two young fellows that we had seen earlier in the day, and they were quite concerned about them. So we set up our camp and got out our binoculars and began looking for them. While we were looking for them, the other campers were surprised and said, "What the heck is that across the lake?"
And across the lake, let me show you where our campsite was here, if I can find this little button. We were right about here, and the campers had noticed there was an object right about here. It was going in this direction, north, just over the treetops. It was a very bright light. There, Charlie's got the cursor. It was a very bright, round sphere of light, and we didn't really know what it was. It was fairly far away. So I took my binoculars out, and I focused in with the binoculars. And as soon as I did focus in, I noticed the quality of light on this thing was very odd. It just struck me as not being right for some reason. And then all of a sudden, the light went like that. It just kind of imploded in on itself and disappeared. So it was like, well, whatever it was, it's gone now. And we just went back to looking for these people out on the water. So we really didn't pay much attention to that.
The other campers, by the way, that were missing were soon spotted at the site that we had abandoned. And so everyone turned in for the night, and the next day we continued traveling upriver to this part of the lake, trying to get to Allagash Lake, a very primitive lake. That proved to be difficult for us because of the swiftness of the water coming down the stream. We abandoned that and camped at this campsite. And this is typical of the campsites on the Allagash water system. The forest up there is very thick and dense and suited for a long-legged moose, but not for short-legged human beings. And we had our campsite all set up and used the clearings that are provided for you. They also have fire pits that you soon learn to build fires and know about how much wood you're going to be burning and how long your fire will burn. And the next day, after we went down and crossed over into Eagle Lake, portaging with our canoes. Whoops, that was a quick portage. It actually took a lot longer than that. But when we carried our canoes into Eagle Lake, this was what we were greeted with. We wanted to take the one campsite that was on our itinerary, but when that didn't work out because of another canoeist ahead of us, we opted for the Smith Brook campsite, the one we were told we weren't supposed to go to. This is a photograph from the Smith Brook campsite. And when we arrived at the site, we gathered our wood, set our shelters up, and decided that we wanted to supplement our provisions and go out and catch some fish, which was one of the reasons we were on the trip, canoeing and fishing and just enjoying the wilderness.
So what we did to prepare for our night event was we waited for the sun to go down, and then shortly after sunset, we built a fairly large campfire. We had planned on being out on the lake for an hour or more at least. And up there, it is pitch black at night. I don't know if any of you have been up in the Maine woods at night, but you literally cannot see your hand in front of your face.
That's true,
And
you can feel the heat.
it is also absolutely silent. There is no sound, there's no trucks, there's no planes, there's no nothing. You may hear an occasional loon off in the distance, or you may hear an occasional cricket. But other than that, it is dead silence and dead dark. So we knew that once we were out on the lake, the only way we would find our way back was to have a fairly large campfire, which we built. And we had logs on that campfire that were at least 8-10 inches in diameter, fairly large logs.
So we'd build a fire that would last, we figured, pretty close to 3 hours or better. And then that way, that was our only point of reference to the shoreline. And we struck out on the lake to this far point over behind these trees.
Can you pick up the
cursor there?
There it is, over here, right about in here.
Well, when we were over in this area, it was some 300 yards from our campsite. And as you can tell by looking at all the dead stumps and branches and everything, perfect structure for fish, but you have to be careful when you're negotiating in a canoe with it.
Right. It took us about 5, maybe 10 minutes at most to get to our fishing spot, so it didn't take long to get out into the lake.
Well, it was pretty dark, and we were just dropping our fishing lines in the water when Chuck Rack said, "What the hell is that?" I was seated in the front of the canoe, and Chuck was in the very back, and Jack and Jim were seated in the middle. We didn't have any life preservers or anything. The water up there is fairly cold, And we were thinking about catching fish, and so when he screamed, he said, "What the hell is that?" This is what I first saw. I did this painting immediately after returning from the Allagash. My first thought was, well, it's the moon rising behind the trees. But no sooner had I thought that I immediately dismissed it, because I realized it was, as you can see the top of this, if you can imagine all of a sudden seeing something rising up, it was this sphere coming in at treetop level toward the edge of the lake. When it came to the edge of the lake, it paused and then began coming along the shoreline in our direction. Well, we sat there and watched it and noticed that it illuminated the trees directly beneath it. And the trees did not sway or move in any fashion, and there was no noise. But we were, mesmerized, or, well, I don't know if mesmerized is a word, but we were certainly
It had our
focused on it.
attention.
Yeah, that's it.
It had our attention. This is a rendition that I did after we got back, and when I turned around and saw this thing, I knew immediately that this was the same object I saw through my binoculars a few days earlier. It had the same odd quality of light, only this time it was a lot more obvious. To my eyes, the surface of this thing roiled. It seemed almost alive. It just constantly moved, almost like
Boiling oatmeal.
boiling oatmeal when you're cooking on the stove. It was just like that, just constant.
But it was this movement of light.
And it was a bright yellow white. It had a slight band of pinkish yellow in the center of it, which would kind of move as this thing roiled around. It made no noise whatsoever, absolutely silent, and it was as big as a 2-story house. This thing was impressive.
So when it was directly across from us, these lights are on us right now, just out of curiosity, we decided, what would this thing do if we shined a flashlight at it? So I, having the flashlight, picked it up. It was one of those square battery camp flashlights. I put my hand over the lens, turned the lamp on, and I semaphored it. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short.
Brilliant, wasn't it?
Don't do this. What happened next, a beam of light literally slammed out of the bottom of this sphere, hit the reeds at the water's edge, and began coming straight out toward us. It was then that we realized the sphere was coming with the light. Well, my curiosity was then satisfied.
Mine too.
So I dropped the flashlight and replaced it with a canoe paddle. I locked my eyes on that campfire, because the one thing we were worried about was ending up in the water, and we didn't want to drown, so we figured, if we make it to shore, at least, they'll find us, hopefully.
Oops.
It seemed like just a moment or a few moments, and we were immediately back on shore, but we were standing on the shore looking at this sphere, which appeared to be very close, so close that we could have thrown a rock or a baseball and hit it. So I picked up the flashlight again. Didn't learn, did I? I shined at it a second time, but this time there was no response from it, except it moved away from us. So as it moved across the lake to the point about which it stopped when we first shined the light, It then began to ascend up and away from us at maybe a 45-degree angle. I had a feeling that it was about to take off very quickly, so I shined the light at my wristwatch, noting where the sweep hand was. When I looked up again, it was already beginning to move.
And what I had remembered was while we were watching this, before it actually took off, the light again imploded in on itself, just like an iris closing, and completely gone. And then a second later, it was up higher and moving away. And then the light would kind of blink out again, and then a second later, the light was higher and further away, and it almost seemed to be making this step pattern. I thought in my mind, I had a picture of somebody taking a Frisbee and throwing a Frisbee, and the Frisbee moves along, and then all of a sudden it'll go up like this and then keep going, and then maybe go up a little more. That's just how this thing took off. There was no sound at all, and this thing was easily moving faster than the speed of sound.
Faster than anything we'd ever seen.
No
and
sonic,
no sound.
No sonic boom. And literally within 3, 4, 5 seconds, this thing was a star in the sky. That's how fast it left.
So I looked back at my watch again, and actually it was, just a few seconds had passed, less than 8 seconds had passed, and it was gone. Well, we stood and just stared into the night sky, and we didn't say a word. All 4 of us were totally silent. And then, sort of in unison, we all turned and walked up to the picnic table. Jack, Jim, and Chuck Rack all sat down. I was about to sit down when I looked over at the campfire and saw that it was completely burned out. And I was puzzled by that. So I walked over, picked up my stick, and hit the coals, and there were tiny wisps of flame. When I was looking at the fire, paddling in the canoe, I was looking at flames about this high. But now, just a few moments later, the fire was down to tiny little embers. But I didn't make that connection. I'm not good at math. And I said to the fellas, I said, hey, the fire's out. Should I put some more wood on it? And they said, no, we're going to turn in. And we were all exhausted. So I was thinking, well, we just did paddle as hard as we could, and the adrenaline's gone, and, we're all exhausted. And each one of us walked off, got into our sleeping bags, and turned in. Now, you would think that the normal reaction would be to be talking about this thing. What was it? I mean, if you went and saw a movie, after the movie, you're going to talk about the movie. If you saw a deer run across in front of your car or something, you're going to talk about that for a little bit. But we didn't talk about it until the next morning, when that was our major topic of conversation. That was all we were talking about. We broke camp and we were talking about it. We got in the canoes and began paddling. And as we were paddling and talking about it, we spied a ranger out on the lake. Because there's rangers all posted all throughout the Allagash. And we signaled the ranger to meet us on shore. He pulled in, and we told him about being chased across the lake by this huge UFO. And he sort of looked at us, and in this deep Maine accent told us that what we had probably seen was spotlights, the Hollywood searchlights, he said, those kind that they have at the movies.
Do you believe that?
They just opened a brand new hardware store in Millinocket. Well, you can see at the bottom of the screen where the red line is. That's where Millinocket is. Oh, and remember that Mount Katahdin? Well, that's 1 mile high, and 90 miles away from where we were was where Millinocket was. So I'm certainly not an engineer, and I don't know how light can have magic qualities, but I was pretty sure that it wasn't a spotlight from Millinocket. So we didn't discuss it further with this ranger, but we continued on with our journey. We were the first people to ever sail up Long Lake, where we lashed 2 canoes together to make a catamaran, fashioned a sail, and as we moved along, we told the rangers that we encountered about this strange light and got varying reactions. At one point, Chuck and I shot some rapids on the river, and Jim and Jack took our gear and went down around.
Now this is another odd little event that occurred when we were talking to the rangers, my brother and I, about portaging around these rapids. They're called chase rapids. They go up to class 3 and 4, which is a lot of white water. And we had never run rapids before, so we decided we didn't want to do it. And when we were talking to one of the rangers about it, he said, "Oh, you don't have to worry about chase rapids. They're not as bad right now as they usually are." And we were like, "Well, what are you talking about? You know, the class 3, 4 rapids." And he said, "Oh, we had this storm that came through here about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, that dumped so much water on the waterway that the water level's about 4.5 feet above normal. So, you know, the rapids are there, but they're not anywhere near as bad as they normally are." And I went, "Wait a minute, gee, that's kind of funny, because when we first landed on the lake, Ranger so-and-so said we couldn't go to Hammock Pond because the water level was too low." And this guy looked at me, he stood back and looked at me, and he goes, "You're one of those guys, aren't you?" Turned his back, walked away, and he wouldn't talk to us anymore.
Well, we continued on. This was our last portage around Allagash Falls, and this was our last day on the Allagash. When looking for firewood, it was finally the weather, which had been beautiful. No moon had been in the skies the entire time we were on our trip. But the clear weather moved off and the rainy weather moved in. And the very last day of our trip, we ran into this fellow named Harry Smith, who brought us some firewood and some eggs, which were the first real food we'd had. We'd been eating lentil bean stew, and the chipmunks wouldn't even eat that after. So he brought us some eggs and bacon and coffee, and we sat and he shared logging stories with us at the Allagash. We told him about the UFO, and when we returned to Boston, we told all of our friends about this. It was the major topic because, you know, this was an incredible event. And after probably about a year, you know, there wasn't a single person that we knew that we hadn't shared the story with. And then we just moved on with our careers, our education, and our lives.
So we're going to go into a different aspect of this case now, one that involved me. In 1978, I had a near-fatal accident in northern Maine, a town called Calais. I walked into a closet in a house in second floor that didn't have a floor in it, fell 2 stories into the basement and did some serious damage to my spine and some head trauma. And it later left me with seizure disorder from the brain damage. It would recur as the symptoms were like recurring heart attack symptoms. And I went through this for a number of years and was ultimately diagnosed at one of the Boston hospitals with temporal limbic epilepsy in 1983. But I'm going a little ahead of myself. Let me back up just 3 years. Around 1980, I started having these horrible nightmares. And it's the typical kind of nightmares you hear from experiencers and abductees of being in their bedrooms and waking up at night, and there's strange figures moving around, or they're doing weird things to you, and you're kind of in a terrified or scared state. At least I was. And you can't figure these things out because sometimes you'd swear you were awake when all this was happening, but you can't really make head nor tails of it, so you call it a nightmare. And these became recurring for me. They started around 1980, and they would just keep happening and happening and happening. And of course, at this time, I was also having seizures. So by the time I was diagnosed in '83, I had a serious sleep disorder problem, and not just trouble sleeping, but I would like go around the house at night before I'd go to bed, and I would, even in the dead of summer, I would make sure every window was closed and locked, and I would padlock myself in my bedroom. And at that time, Charlie was one of my roommates. We lived with a number of roommates in Boston, which is how most people can afford their housing there. And they used to say, "Gee, Jim, you're acting a little strange these days." And I'd say, "Look, I don't want to talk about this. Just leave me alone." So this kept going on, and eventually I wound up in the hospital because I wasn't sleeping properly, and my seizure activity was going way up. So they put me in the hospital to do some sleep studies. And while I was in the hospital, I was bored one day, laying in bed, and I asked one of the nurses if she could bring me in something to read. So she brought in a few books, and one of them happened to be Whitley Strieber's book, Communion, I believe. And when I saw the face on the cover, I just became really highly agitated. I got very upset. I screamed a little bit at the nurse and asked her to remove this rubbish from my room. I had never read his books. I knew nothing about Whitley Strieber. I had not made any connection between these dreams I was having and this UFO event that happened, years before. And that resulted in one of the doctors coming in and saying, "Geez, Jim, you're acting a little strange today. You want to talk about this?" And of course I didn't. But eventually he got these dreams out of me. We sat down and we went through the content. And he said, "Well, I just had dinner last week with one of my colleagues who actually turned out to be John Mack, and he said, this colleague of mine is working with people like you who are having similar dreams. And I don't want you to judge me right now, but I want to ask you an odd question. Have you ever seen a UFO?" And I just looked at this doctor, and I was like, "What the heck are you talking about?" Yeah, as a matter of fact, I have. But what's that have to do with, seizures and nightmares? I'm really worried about this. Could we focus on the seizure problem, please? And he was like, "Well, just be cool, Jim. Calm down." And he said, "Look, this Dr. Mack's patients are having their dreams just like yours, and I think there's some connection here between your dreams and your UFO sighting, and I would like you to either go talk to Dr. Mack or see someone in the UFO community that's can help you with this." And I was like, "No, absolutely not. I don't want to have anything to do with UFOs or none of this stuff. I don't care about Dr. Mack or anybody else." And I was just, I just didn't want to do it. Well, a week later, the doctor calls me back again and says, "Gee, Jim, there's a guy named Raymond Fowler who at that time was head of investigations for MUFON in the Northeast. And he was doing a UFO conference in one of the neighboring towns. And my doctor said, I've already talked to him, and I told him that you would be coming to see him. And so would you please do me a personal favor and go see this guy, make an effort. Go see this guy, and I'm really concerned for you." So, it was a personal favor. What can you say? And so I did. And I went to see Ray, and he was expecting me, and I gave him our story. And after I finished telling him about our sighting in Maine, because at that time that's all it was, he said, I want you to fill out one of our standard MUFON report forms, you and your brother and the other two guys, and send those back to me.
Well, Jim brought the forms back and gave them to his brother, Chuck Rack, and myself, and after we had filled the forms out and returned them to Ray, he began contacting, because of the information we'd provided, including the name of one of the rangers and his assistant whom we had made the report to. Ray contacted the ranger and then contacted some of our friends that we had listed, that we had told of our experience in '76, and began a background investigation on us. Ray had been an investigator in the U.S. Air Force debriefing pilots who had made sighting reports. We didn't know that at the time. So after he had done some background on us, talked to people, family members and friends, and learned that we had indeed talked about our sighting being chased across the lake, and we had provided sketches, and all of our sketches excited his interest, so he contacted us and asked if he could do a more detailed investigation. And thus began a really thorough investigation. He sent us an MMPI examination, which is a battery of test questions, about 800 questions. And we filled out those reports, moved them back to him, and then he moved on to the next phase, which was hypnotic regression.
I was the first one to undergo the hypnotic regression, and I had never been hypnotized before, and frankly, I didn't really put much stock in it. I thought it was kind of a carnival type trick, because I didn't know. And but actually, it was very easy for them to hypnotize me. Ray had a very good hypnotist named Tony Constantino, and we had a number of sessions which were just absolutely harrowing. They had a very difficult time with me because every time they would get me down into a deep hypnotic state, and I would start remembering what happened up on the Allagash, I would become very excited, so excited that they were afraid I was going to have a seizure. So they had to keep bringing me out and bringing me back down, and bringing me out and bringing me back down. But over time, they managed to get quite a bit of information out of me, which I didn't know what to make of. But we did it, and one of the things that we had agreed to was they said, look, we're going to be hypnotizing each one of you separately, and we don't want you talking about the content of your hypnotic regression sessions with the other three guys, which I agreed to, and so did we all. And so we all went through about a year of hypnotic regression without knowing what the other ones came up with at all. But one of the things we were all doing is immediately after our regressions, we were all doing artwork, which also was not being shown to one another.
So we each went in, as Jim said, and were regressed. I figured, well, the only thing that happened was we were out fishing. We saw this thing. I shined a flashlight at it. It responded, chased us across the lake, went away, end of story. But as Paul Harvey would say, this was the rest of the story. It brought us back to that night and that campfire on the Allagash in August of 1976, when I shined the flashlight and the sphere returned its beam of light and began chasing us across the lake. I remember under regression that Jim and his brother Jack screaming, "Paddle, Charlie, paddle." And my looking at the campfire, and I didn't really need a lot of encouragement. If I could have got out and run, I would have done that. This is a rendering that I did which depicts what Jack and Jim and Chuck remember. As the beam of light came up behind us and stopped us, basically. I was focused on the fire, and so I couldn't remember being in this beam. My first memory was looking at my toes and wondering where my socks were. And then I thought, well, geez, where are my shoes? And then noticing that I didn't have any clothes on, I thought, where the hell are my clothes? And then the fast thinker that I am, then I thought, where am I? So I was lifting my head as high as I could, and I could see I wasn't physically restrained, but I felt like I was lying on a cool leather surface. And I could see beyond my toes my three friends, Jim, Jack, and Chuck. And they were all sitting there with these blank expressions on their face, like they were waiting for a bus or something. And I was trying to scream, but the only thing that I was hearing besides the rapid beating of my heart was my mind screaming, help me, you guys, help me. What the hell's wrong with you? Help me, get me out of here. And I'm leaning up, and all of a sudden, unknown to me, this face looks down at me, and this was what it was. Well, then I was trying to get away from that, and I slammed my head back down on the surface. And as soon as I made eye contact with this being, I don't know if any of you have had the sensation of dropping in an elevator or an escalator and having your stomach suddenly surge up a little, but I could feel my conscious thinking mind being pulled up into this being. And then all of a sudden, it was like someone was with me. And they said to me, don't be afraid. You won't be harmed. Comply. Do as you're told. And for some reason, that I was reassured, and so I did comply.
Now, we all had slightly different takes on things that happened, and I want you to understand that what came out of the hypnotic regression sessions was not in chronological order. They kind of got little snippets of memories from us, some
sort of like trailers in a movie that flash up.
And so we each one of the four of us has different takes on what came down with this business on the ship. So I just want you to realize that we have slightly different takes on some things. Like under hypnosis, I didn't remember hearing voices in my head at all. Nobody told me to be calm and I wouldn't be hurt. I did seem to get some type of impressions, though, where I seemed to know what they wanted. I just knew when they wanted me to do something, but I don't remember hearing any voices, and I certainly don't remember hearing them say, relax, nothing's going to happen to you, which didn't help the way I kind of interacted with these things. I was absolutely terrified of what was going on, and I truly feared for my life. This was not a pleasant experience. We have nothing against other experiencers or abductees claiming that they have positive experiences. We believe many people on that point, but ours was not positive. It was terrifying, absolutely terrifying.
Well, imagine yourself as a polar bear or something, just walking along, and all of a sudden you feel a sharp stab, and then the next thing, here's something lifting up your lip, sticking you with things you don't know. And we observed these beings, doing tests and other things to us that we were not understanding. They were totally different. This is a rendering that Jack did of the hand of the being. I remember at one point standing in front of this large portal and looking down into the water, seeing the empty canoe and the campfire on the opposite side. This is a rendering that Jack did, and the rendering that you had seen that I had shown before of lying on the back, the first time that I saw This rendering was when Ray Fowler brought all four of us together for the first time and began laying out the artwork in front of us and letting us for the first time share our experience.
Now, let me go back here a second. You notice on some of these renderings here that Jack did, this frontal part of the face almost looks like it's some kind of mask. I mean, it's both he and I got the impression that the actual heads that we were looking at weren't what they really looked like, that they had some kind of covering, possible mask. And Jack did a much better job than I do. He's the real artist. I'm the potter. So he's a much better drawer than I, and he did a pretty accurate rendition. Where is this pointer thing?
I don't know.
But you can see on where's the little pointer? Do we have it?
Yeah, it's right there in front of you.
Okay, you can see right here where you can almost see the demarcation of the line. So it's very possible that these things could have been wearing some kind of mask. Okay, Charlie.
Well, one of the things that Jim had done was tried to get out of there and attack these beings.
Yeah, I was laying on this table, and I was terrified, and I thought, you know, they're kind of scrawny little creatures. They were very thin, kind of scrawny looking, and I thought, maybe I could kick one of them, or push one of them, or grab one of them, and create some kind of disturbance or a distraction, and then we could get out of this place. That was basically what I was thinking. And as soon as I had that thought, there were two of these beings on either side of the table. They immediately moved 10 feet in the blink of an eye. And then there was another one that came out with these kind of, they almost look like a hockey puck type object, which they placed on the front of each one of my shins. And when they did that, I could not move my legs. And to this day, in that exact location, I have no hair that grows there. And it is the perfect shape of these pucks. So I don't know how they worked or what the technology was, but once they got them on my legs, I couldn't move my legs, and then I knew, well, this is it. There's no way I can resist these things. They're going to do what they want, and we'll let the cards fall as they be.
This is a rendering that Jack did. The next several renderings I'm going to show you are Jim's twin brother had done, where he remembers being taken into this room that had a strange pulsating light quality. I don't know if any of you have gone to the optometrist. Most of us have gone to eye doctors and had our eyes dilated. And the sensation that my eyes were very, very similar to that type of experience. My eyes were a bit watery. My depth of field focus was maybe only about 8 to 10 feet. And everything was very bright around me, sort of like a pearl white type of color. We went through a battery of examinations, and that's the only thing I can explain. That was the reason I mentioned the polar bear, because I can't explain what was done to us, what was learned from us. We were placed on this exam table, and we had this vibration run through us, much like if you've had a tuning fork put behind your ear. Well, every atom in our bodies pulsed. We were subjected to, this is the closest that we can illustrate with pictures. Remember, one picture is worth 1,000 words, and I trip over my own tongue. These renderings were done by Jack, and they very, very clearly sort of illustrate what we encountered. The following renderings are done by Jack, Jim, and myself. These were the first time we had seen them when we were with Ray, so they vary a little bit, but they're all the same. Just our point of view is all slightly different, much like if you were in an automobile accident and you as the driver observes one thing and you as a passenger sees the same event but slightly different. These are the renderings that we each turned in. I wish Jack could be here because he is really a very articulate individual. This rendering in the upper left-hand side was the first thing that I drew after my hypnotic regression. The first piece of paper I encountered was a napkin, and I took a felt-tip pen and drew the hands as I recalled them. They were, as shown, different than ours. Instead of the 5 digits that we have with an opposing thumb, their hand had the ability to fold in the middle, and they had 4 opposing digits. This is a rendering that Jack had done showing the back side of the hand, the palm side, and then this is a rendering of one of the instruments that Jack recalled. And you can see on the right-hand side the 4 fingers of the being controlling the tool. I don't know what it did, but it emitted a blue light from the bottom and it had a needle-like appearance, highly reflective, almost like chrome. This is another instrument that was used that Jack had rendered. Oh.
Yeah, this is another little oddity. One of the things that happened to Jack was he suddenly had a cyst of some sort, a lump that appeared on one of his shins, and he had to go to the hospital and have it removed. It was very painful. And they told him that they were going to send this tissue sample to the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta for a biopsy to see what it was. A few months went by, he goes back to the doctor to find out what's going on. The doctor is not giving him any answers. A few more months go by, the doctor calls him and says, well, your report came in, you can go and get it. So he went to get it, and when he went into the radiology department, they kept saying, oh, you were in the military, weren't you? And he said, no, I was never in the military. And they said, well, you had to be. This is a military biopsy report. Instead of the tissue being sent to the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, it was sent to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C. The report was signed by Colonel William A. Cohen, who was the director of the institute. The report basically stated that the tissue was non-cancerous, and it was a type of tissue that grows from the bone when, say, somebody has
a needle biopsy.
A needle biopsy done for removing bone marrow or something like that. The surface of the bone gets irritated and it creates this growth, and that's what that was. So it was a little odd. It was very odd that instead of the tissue sample going to where the original doctor sent it, it wound up in this Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. We never were able to figure that out.
Well, the hospital where they removed the tissue, their pathology department could not determine what type of tumor it was, which was one of the reasons it was sent off and sent forward. The renderings that we're going to have to move through a little quickly are those done by Jack. This is a rendering that he did showing the costume that these beings have, and they have like a belt buckle, which is some sort of remote control which permits them to travel through solid objects, which Jack remembers an incident in his home where he watched these beings come right through a solid sliding glass door.
Yeah, we started also having post-Allagash incidents. They began for me again in 1980. I had one in Texas in 1980, another one in Ojai, California in 1981. There were a number of them that occurred up at Jack and Mary's in Vermont, one which involved Charlie. He'll talk about that shortly. In fact, next, right?
Yeah. Well,
okay,
well, one of the things I wanted to show was this is a page I photocopied out of a NICAP manual, and it shows the type of object. This number 6 was the type of spherical object that we had seen. In 1993, I was staying at Jack and Mary's home up in Vermont, and their house is built on the 4 points of the compass, each wall facing north, south, east, or west. And when we turned in for the night, Jack and Mary had gone upstairs and I was sleeping downstairs. I laid down, and out through the kitchen window I spied the full moon and laid down and drifted off to sleep. Well, they had a small miniature schnauzer named Ixley, and Ixley had a habit of coming down and pulling one of your socks out of your shoe and treating it like a piece of bubble gum, so you had a nice juicy footwear in the morning.
typical schnauzer.
So in the middle of the night, I woke up and sat bolt right up, wide awake, and looked around for the dog, because I figured the dog was after my socks. And I looked down, saw that my socks were there, so I tucked them in the shoe a little bit deeper, looked around to see what had awakened me. I noticed out the sliding glass doors right in front of me that the backyard was illuminated, so I thought I hadn't been asleep that long and that the moon must be directly over the house. Well, I went to lay down on my right side, which would have me facing west and looking out their living room window, when I saw the full moon. So I looked to the right out the window looking at the moon, and then I looked at the backyard in front of me, and then I noticed these grays standing. There were about 8 of them, and the tallest of which was approximately this tall. The others were about so tall. The tallest turned and looked directly at me, and then the others, in unison, like a flock of birds or a school of fish, turned and looked at me as well, and then they all began moving forward. Well, I'm like 43 years of age at this time, and you know, the next thing I did surprised me. I laid down and pulled the covers over my head. I mean, when I was 10 years old, you would have found me in the next county and still running. And so I woke up in the morning and I thought, God, this was like the weirdest thing. It must have been a dream, you know, maybe a flashback to the Allagash or some crazy thing. So when I had breakfast with Jack and Mary the following morning, I told them this story. Well, you know how husbands and wives communicate with looks. And Jack looked at Mary, and Mary looked at Jack, and they both looked at me, and then they both looked at each other, and I said, yeah, okay, I know crazy Charlie. And Jack shook his head and said, no, I haven't told you this. And Mary says, tell him. 2 weeks earlier, Jack had awakened in the middle of the night, thinking that the dog wanted to go out, and it always had a habit of scratching on the sliding glass doors. So Jack got out of bed, walked halfway down the stairs, looked at the sliding glass doors, didn't see the dog, but did see several grays with that remote control belt buckle I was showing you a little while ago, and saw these grays step through the sliding glass door. When he saw that, He turned around, ran back upstairs, jumped into bed, said, "I know what the hell's going on, and I ain't doing it." Pulled the covers over his head.
My brave twin.
That night, his wife had a dream about 6 deer standing around the bed looking at her.
These experiences not only occurred up at my brother and his wife's home in Vermont, but also in the house Charlie and I were living in Boston. In 1995, we lived in a house that looked very similar to this. This is the house actually right next door to us. If I can find the cursor, I'll bring it up here again, but I don't see it, so I'm going to use this instead of, because we're running out of time here. But right opposite this part of the house was Charlie's bedroom window. He lived in the top part of the house. My wife and I lived downstairs. His bedroom was directly above ours. And one morning in 1995, I had a abduction dream. In the middle of the night, woke up, blue flashing lights out the window, can't move because there's a 100-pound weight on your chest. Woke up the next morning, run into Charlie. He says he had the same experience that night. Well, we go outside, and this is what we see directly across from Charlie's window. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to remove ivy from stucco, but it never comes off like that. This literally looked like somebody took a cookie cutter, took the ivy right off the house. I mean, there was nothing left. I went and questioned the neighbors about, why'd they do this? They denied doing anything. We lived in this house for 27 years, never saw anything like, to this day, I have no idea what caused that. None whatsoever. But it was definitely a shared abduction experience is all we can come up with.
And the owners of the house were totally unaware when Jim asked them if they had done anything.
You pushed the slide down and see.
No, they were just gone, except for some. This photograph was taken several days after, and there was some of the vines had
started
moved.
To drop a little bit, from the weight.
But one of the things about the Allagash that affected us we were unaware of was in our artwork. All 4 of us were artists. And when we returned from Maine in 1976, I was training myself to be a school teacher because I figured that was the only way I could, be an artist for 3 months out of the year. Jack was a painter. This is the type of paintings that Jack was doing at the time.
This is pre-Allagash.
And this one, and this was a rendering that he did that is in the Smithsonian's permanent collection. He also has some in the Museum of Fine Arts. But he went from doing the type of artwork we just showed you to doing work that involved grids. He suddenly became obsessed with mathematics. I began being interested in medicine and the medical arts, and Jack just pursued math. Well, my math skills are 2 + 4 = a 6-pack, But Jack, what Jack does now, using his math skills, is coat optics for the space program at a company up in Vermont.
His optics have been on the last 3 Mars missions and will be on the next Mars mission. They're also doing optics for the next generation Hubble. Often when I drive up to visit him and his wife, I'll stop off at his workplace to stop in and say hello. And I'll walk in and he's in the middle of something, and I just can't believe my brother is doing this stuff. It's just, to me, it's so far over my head. I can't make head or tails of it, and I can't understand how he can do this. But he loves it. He says, well, this is what I do now, and it's a lot of fun, and it's easy, so he doesn't get paid much, but he likes his work. And, for years, when he was doing this, just after the Allagash, he had no idea what it meant or anything like that. And one day, a friend of ours came in. He was a student over at MIT and a mathematician. And he looked at these grids and said, geez, Jack, you know, this grid mathematics that you're working on is very similar to what's called unified vector geometry. And of course, we were like, huh? And he said that you should check this out. It has to do with the world grid and blah, 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 blah. But eventually, he brought over a book by, it was edited by David Hatcher Childress called Anti-Gravity in the World Grid. And indeed, when he went in and showed us what this unified vector geometry looked like, I have to admit, it looked a lot like some of the stuff that Jack was working on. I mean, we have no way to connect one with the other, but visually, it was striking. It really made an impression on us. So who knows?
Well, these worldwide grid also involve ley lines, where some of the worldwide grid does intersect. So it's an unknown thing to us.
It's one of those mysteries. Well, my work also changed. At the time we went up the Allagash, I was a student at Boston University's program in artisanry, and I was working towards a master's degree in ceramics. I had always wanted to be a potter all my life. And I had done some pottery up to that time, but it was, as you can see, it was came from a tradition of German potters in Pennsylvania, where I grew up. And so, you know, I planned on being a fairly straightforward production potter, making bowls, plates, cups, so on and so forth, simple glazes. And immediately after coming back from the Allagash, I started making this stuff. Almost got me kicked out of school. But I couldn't stop. I was obsessed with a lot of things, but part of it was some type of weird process thing with energy that you could simultaneously create form and surface and integrate it with fire. It was this weird concept. I had no idea why I was doing this, but it was fully formed in my head when I came back. It was just like that, and it was there. And I started making this kind of stuff. I had no idea what it meant, none at all. All I knew was I had to make it. And these are some pots that I've done since the Allagash. I'll go through these a little
That's all right.
quickly. Do we have time? We still have time to go through this fairly slowly. So for those of you who live out here in the Southwest, you can obviously see that somehow or another, petroglyphs are coming into my imagery. The palette and colors of the Southwest have worked their way in somehow. I have no idea what this means, none whatsoever. But this is what I do, and I love doing it. When I'm doing this, I feel like I am with the one. That's all I can tell you. In fact, after my accident, I had to give it up for a long time because of the spinal and neural damage. I couldn't work with pots anymore, and I actually walked away from it for 23 years. I just started doing it again 4 years ago, and it felt like I was reborn. So I'm very happy that I'm doing this again.
I myself am a representational artist, and my style of art didn't change, but the subject matter did. Because of my interests, my new interests in the medical arts and medical sciences, I started studying medical illustration with Sylvia Keene from Harvard Medical School, and I took courses in human anatomical dissection and human anatomy at Tufts Medical School and Boston University School of Medicine. I'm currently employed as a medical artist and clinical medical photographer. These are, and believe me, I spared you, things that I do and see are what I refer to as the train wrecks of medicine. Anything that's very abnormal, highly unusual, I'm called into an operating theater to photograph. And in the last 35 years, I've seen some of the most unusual sides of medicine that most physicians in their entire lifetime never see. But they all call me to come in. I used to do technical illustrations for surgical procedures, medical researchers, for grants, for surgical manuals, and so on and so forth. This was a rendering I did for the optometry folks. But the type of work that I do, I work in all different mediums. I won't bore you with a lot of this stuff. This was my present to my uncle, who was a career Navy guy. I do miniature carvings and sculpture, and you can see by the coins in there that they're not very large. And I also do a lot of fine art photography. This is the first sculpture I ever did. This is about 20 inches tall, and I just recently did this from a live model. One of the things that we want to take time to do is to thank Ray Fowler, because if it weren't for Ray, we would have never known and or learned of the experience that we had in the northern woods of Maine in 1976. And since that time, we've met some of the finest researchers in the country and have been able to share our experience and learn more about what did happen to us up in Maine.
One of the things that came out of this case just recently, a few years ago in fact, was a letter that was mailed to Ray Fowler by someone who had actually witnessed these craft on the Allagash while we were there. This just came to light a few years ago, and I would like to read part of that letter to you, if I may. We're not going to put it up on the screen because we could never get a hold of the person who wrote it to get his permission to mention his name, so we'd rather leave him anonymous. But it was he was a logger who was logging up in that very specific area where we were, up on the Allagash in 1976, and I'll go through some of this.
You have time, read it.
We have time. He says, Ray, per our telephone conversation, I am attaching my short narrative that you wanted. This was when I was working in the woods for the Great Northern Paper in 1976. The Great Northern Paper Company is the company that logs the forest around the Allagash. It's a huge wilderness forest. I am not the type of person who seeks limelight. I just want to help the four guys know that they were not alone, and I hope they are moving on with their lives. And so he begins this short description. He says, I was working out of Telos Woods Camp for the Great Northern Paper Company, Woodlands Division, as a logger on the mechanical crew operating a harvester. For those of you who aren't familiar with logging, a harvester is this big tractor that goes in and grabs the trees, and it's got these big clamps on, and they carry them around, and they stack them up, and then another truck comes and picks them up. That's a harvester. So he goes on to say, my assigned location to cut was on the Red Rip Road in section T4R12 on the night shift from 4 p.m. to 4 a.m. with two other co-workers. They were also operating harvesters within 1 to 2 mile radius from where I was. The incident occurred sometime during the summer of 1976 on a moonless but clear, starry night. While working in my mechanical harvester, I noticed a red glow as if the top of the machine was on fire. I immediately shut off my machine to include the lights, I don't know what include means, and grabbed my 20-pound fire extinguisher from behind my seat and jumped out of my machine onto the ground to put out the fire. Instead of fire, there was a red beam of light. that encircled my machine like a stage spotlight. I looked to follow the beam to treetop level, which was about 60 to 70 feet high, mostly spruce and fir. There was a large round object about 2 times the size of what a full moon would look like, and it was about 3 to 6 feet above the treetops. This thing was close. The object in the sky was round, but I could not tell if it was like a ball or a plate. The light was coming from the object. It did not make any noise. I did remember my other 2 coworkers were not operating because it was really quiet. I believed I watched it maybe 5 minutes. Then I saw the beam of light retract into the object without a sound. Once the beam retracted fully into the object shrunk to half its size with no sound. Then it took off at an incredible rate of speed, again with no sound. At the end of the shift, I met my friends. Both said they saw the beam of light, but not sure what it was from. We never spoke about it because it was as if it wasn't real, and we were afraid the others would laugh at us. 5 years later, I was assigned to another camp called Comstock. One evening, while in the day room, some of the guys started talking about weird things happening in the woods. We talked about what was the weirdest and scariest or weirdest thing that ever happened to you while in the woods. Bear in mind, we're always alone in these remote areas. One of the mechanics mentioned his experience while stationed at Telos 5 years ago. This is 1976. He was driving a mechanic's truck in the woods late at night and stated there was a bright white light following him that came out of nowhere. He thought it was a game warden, so he slowed down to pull over. The ball of light went over his truck and went down the road at an incredible rate of speed. He realized it was not a vehicle because nothing he knew could travel that fast. He was not sure on the distances, but it made a 90-degree turn to the left and it stopped in the middle of the woods. At treetop level, the light changed from white to red. He saw a beam of red come out of the object. When he told me the location, which was where I was cutting, after this conversation, I never talked about it again because it didn't seem important to me to talk about it. While employed for the Great Northern Paper Company, 16 years as a mechanized equipment operator, I have never seen anything like this before. Sometime in the mid or late 1990s, I was flicking through the channels and heard the words Allagash 4. It was a show called Unsolved Mysteries. I said, oh my God, I was there. This was the letter that Ray received from this gentleman. So this is the first time in all these years that we actually had at least the sighting of these objects corroborated by an independent witness.
We would like to take this time to say thank you to a few people. Jack, who couldn't be here, Bud Hopkins, who has helped us quite a number of times over the years, our friend Ann Ramsey Collier, and the late John Mack, whom we knew for about 20 years, as well as everybody that's involved here. There was a little bit of trivia I wanted to share with everybody. 104 years ago today, about 400 miles off the coast of San Francisco, old coal-powered battle cruiser, the USS Supply, was steaming south when the crew and the captain observed 3 meteors come down out of the sky. These meteors came below the cloud level, and were observed for over 3 minutes, in which amount of time they changed direction and then went back up into the sky. You'll notice that the one has a point on it like a tail. That was actually the front leading edge of these meteors. One, about the largest, was about 6 times the size of the sun. The next was about 3.5 times the size of the sun, and the following about 1.5 times the size of the sun. Well, this was some 90 days after Orville and Wilbur Wright had flown at Kitty Hawk that these were observed. So the only thing that the commanding officer entered in his log, and this was a Lieutenant John Schofield, who at the beginning of the Second World War was the fleet battleship commander of the Second World War. The New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and several other papers across the country picked up the story in March of 1904. So I just thought that that was kind of an unusual thing to run across, especially when we're here today on the 28th of February. I'd like to, at this time, if anybody was interested, this was the book that had been mentioned, written by Ray, and the foreword was by Bud. And I wanted to share with you the latest U.S. government UFO identifying chart. So I don't want anybody to be confused in the future as to what they're looking at. Well, one of the things that you may have noticed that Jim and I do is we have accepted what has happened to us. We got out of it alive. I didn't get out of it with my hair. These bald guys, I think, came back for it. But if something doesn't kill you, it has to make you stronger. And my grandfather always said, no matter what we encounter in life, there's going to be tragedy, pathos, and sadness. Try to find the humor in any event, because that's where you'll learn a good lesson. That's where you can carry something away with you that will help you get through the rough spots.
You know, Charlie and I often joke, among other, we've known each other for 34 years. And so we found, since this Allagash business started, that for us, sometimes the only way we can deal with it is to laugh about it. And you know, we do that when we sometimes talk to people and we give presentations, and sometimes people are a little taken aback by our kind of slightly flippant nature. But really, you can't imagine how difficult it is for us to be up here to talk about this. We don't know what they did to us, but they definitely programmed into us some type of an aversion response, is the name we give it. And by that I mean every time we begin our story, we get goosebumps that rush up and down our arms. Our hearts beat like you can't believe. We feel about as anxious as a person ready to be shot in front of a firing squad. It is the most uncomfortable feeling you can imagine. And each time we go through the hypnotic regression memories, many of those memories, not all of which we had time to share with you today, but are in the book, are extremely frightening and difficult to deal with. So it's not easy for us to talk about this stuff, but we do this because we believe it's important for other people who have shared these same kinds of experiences to know that they are not crazy, and that there are people here who believe them and share their experiences and sympathize with them and are here to support them. It's very important to have support, whether it's parental or sibling or peer. The support is extremely important in order to learn how to deal with this. It's not easy. So we tend to laugh at it because it's the best way that we can deal with it.
Are you still being abducted?
We don't know. We haven't had any experiences,
since
conscious.
95.
Yeah, I mean, every now and then I'll wake up with one of these bedroom nightmares. I still have the nightmares. So does my brother Jack. So those are still ongoing. How real they are, it's really hard to say. Many times I'll wake up in the middle of the night and I'll swear this stuff is going on when I am wide awake. And then the next morning, the only way I can deal with it is by saying, oh, to my wife anyways, honey, I had one of those nightmares. So it's ongoing. I think it's ongoing. And It's much more complicated than we've been able to describe to you in our limited time. There's much more in the book, and I'm not trying to get you to buy the book. We didn't get into this for money. We don't make any money on the book. But there is a lot more in the book. Ray Fowler did an excellent job writing this book, and you really get the impression of how we felt when we were under hypnosis and all this other stuff. We didn't get a chance to talk about what went on in my brother Jack and mine's childhood. There's a whole nother aspect to this case that involves abductions when we were small children that we used to rationalize away as a ghost called Harry. We can't even get into that. There's so much more to this case, and it just keeps getting stranger and stranger by the year. So if you are interested in this case, I highly recommend that you get the book. There's much more available there.
You can find it maybe in your public library.
Yeah, it was out of print for a while, but it is back in print now, so you should be able to get it through Amazon. So with that, we'd like to thank you all for bearing your time with us. Thank you very much.